children. Our eldest Matthew is 30, and he currently lives in Denmark with his lovely wife and our two grandchildren. I have a son, Gareth, who's 27. He's married and lives in Malvern and is church planting in Malvern. And I have a daughter who's 21 next week, and I can hardly believe that my little girl is 21 next week, and she's studying at one of the universities here in Birmingham. And I've been in Elim ministry for 34 years. It's lovely to see Betty Crawford. Betty, go back many, many years when Betty and Cameron were in Burton. And their son Paul, we knew each other when I was much younger. Paul was young as well. So I've been serving Elim all that time, an Elim boy growing up in Elim. And as Marcus said, I've led in Elim churches for over 30 years, and then have the privilege 5 years ago been invited to occupy this new role really in Elim, or certainly a new form of this role, going back to the field superintendent's role of pre-year 2000, where I had the joy of serving and working with our ministers and all matters that relate to ministers across our movement, and working alongside our general superintendent. So it's a delight to be with you. And my topic this evening, I'm going to share screen off my other device here because it helps me see all of you, is all about, as you already know, Christian leadership and confrontation. I don't know how skilled you are at Zoom, but I've learned when that big screen comes up, I'm able to do a little drag to the left of the gallery and make the screen of people bigger and the slides smaller. So if you know how to do that, then you can see everybody else and see the slides. I not too long ago finished a master's, theology master's at Regent's Theological College. And when I came to do my dissertation, I'd want to do something that was practical, something that would aid me in the role that I have, but something that I could really get my teeth into and learn some fresh understanding. Well, I've been in Elim all my life, a pastor for 34 years, leading churches for nearly 30, and I've had to learn all about confrontation and conflict, because it kind of goes with the territory of leadership, and not just in the church, but leadership at all levels, really, whether in industry, in commerce, in education, in third sector, charity leadership. If you want to lead people, if you want to live among people, then understanding how conflict can happen and confrontation and a positive approach to those things, I think, is essential. Now, when we talk about the whole topic of confrontation and conflict, I can almost hear some of you say, no, thank you, I'd like to sign out of that. And I think some of us approach the idea of confrontation and conflict a little bit like the characters in one of the storybooks my kids liked us to read most to them when they went to bed. And it's called We're Going on a Bear Hunt. Some of you have a wave at me if you know all about We're Going on a Bear Hunt, If you've got children, grandchildren, you might know it. It's this rather unique children's story where for some reason a family decided to take their two little children to hunt for bears. Now, that would not be advised, but it's a kid's story after all. And at every point on their journey, they're met with weather conditions, but also ground conditions, rivers and big fields and all kinds of things that prove to be obstacles to them. And there's this recurring little chorus throughout it all where they say something like this when they come to an obstacle: we can't go over it, we can't go under it, oh no, we've got to go through it. And I think sometimes that is true when we face situations where we know we're going to have to confront something in order to move forward in a relationship, in a project, in a sense of accomplishing our vision. I often think it must be like the children of Israel who, as they get to the River Jordan at the end of 38 years or so of wandering in the wilderness, they think, okay, if we get over this river, okay, we've got to go through it and God's going to take us through it. And then we get the land that's flowing with milk and honey. And so, as you know, God does a miracle and they manage to get through the waters of Jericho, the Jordan River. And lo and behold, the next thing they realize is there's this big fortified city of Jericho. And they walk around that for 6 days at God's instruction, and they have to walk right down the middle of the street. What's interesting is if you read the book of Joshua and Judges, you realize that for a number of generations, they were still going through confrontation to possess the promises that they had in front of them. meant often confronting the enemies that stood in their way and the obstacles. Now, I want to try to show you today, if I can, that not all confrontation is a bad thing. Now, some people's personalities would mean that you think instantly, the moment there's any sense of confrontation, you'd rather run a mile and you feel somehow insignificant in the light of it. I'd like to show you at some points this evening that confrontation can be a good thing. But what we also have to recognize is that generally churches don't do confrontation particularly well. Here's a quote from a guy called Hugh Halverstad in a book he wrote, where he said this, that Christians fight, they also fight dirty. Issues are personalized. Gossip and hearsay fog up reason and common sense. Enemy-making wounds shred long-standing friendship. It's no wonder that so many thoughtful Christians avoid church conflicts like the plagues of Egypt. Now, some of you might automatically be thinking of difficult situations you've been through in your life, in your church scenario, where that would be true, painful, difficult times. And some conflict is actually inevitable. You can't stop it happening. It's going to be there. And I want to suggest to you that it's good to decide early on or before you face such situations how you might actually approach it. This next diagram, which I developed, suggests that there may be 4 ways that people, in terms of personality, approach conflict. Some people are reactive and they would run towards a conflict situation. When something happens, when a fuse is lit, when there's a challenge, they just run at it and they would just confront it. And it can, if you're not careful, be not only defensive, but aggressive. Some people are quite the opposite. At the first sign of confrontation or conflict, they simply want to run away. They want to resign. I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to be a leader, elder, deacon, pastor, leading that business, working in that company. I just want to run away. And that, when one does that, it's being at the very least evasive. I'm just having nothing to do with it. Some people will retreat. They'll walk away from it. It's less obvious, but they're being passive. They're not necessarily approaching the situation to bring out some kind of resolution. I want to suggest to you that the most positive way to respond to conflict is to walk towards it, to respond, not react, but to respond. And a little later on, towards the end in the practical section of application, I'd like to share with you the difference between a response and a reaction. I wonder where you see yourself on that little diagram. I'm not asking you to tell me, but we'd all like to think, well, we can actually respond to something thoughtfully, intelligently, prayerfully. But some of us might feel actually at the first sign of conflict or confrontation, we're either going to run at it or run away from it. And my aim today is to unpack some of the causes of conflict, some of the different levels of conflict that can exist. But I want to spend a good amount of time talking about healthy conflict and landing it with talking about a positive approach to conflict. And what I'll do, at the end of the next section, I'm going to pause and we'll have some Q&A and you can ask a few questions. So it gives my voice a break and some interaction with you. We'll have a couple of points, we'll do that. And at the end of our time, we'll do some Q&A, but then we'll go into breakout rooms where you can chat to each other and maybe earth a few of the things I've been able to share with you this evening. Let's think a little bit about the causes of conflict. When I was doing my research on conflict, I looked at a lot of sources that weren't just about church ministry, but there were general leadership books. One of those was a book by a guy called Bernard Mayer called The Dynamics of Conflict Resolution. And he suggests this wheel helps identify some of the major causes of conflict. I think these apply into our context in church life and leadership. And he suggests that actually most, if not all, conflict revolves around a central common factor and denominator, and that's human need. That the center of what causes conflict is a need in us or somebody else that isn't being resolved, isn't being met, that can create these kinds of reactions. And so these 5 common causes, let me unpack them a little bit to you. The first of those is communication. Now, those of you who've been involved in pastoral ministry, you will know that when there's conflict in marriages, often one of the first signs of conflict in a marriage is a breakdown in communication, the inability to connect conversationally with one another. And actually, the real hub of things is we as human beings find it very difficult to communicate well when our emotions are running high or running deep on a matter. And that's part of humanity. That's part of understanding that we are complex beings, and we have feelings and we have perceptions and we have layers of understanding that when somebody else challenges them, ignores them, doesn't understand them, can raise all kinds of issues for us. And often the challenge of communication is exacerbated in deeply held issues because we're imperfect beings. And I think that this is true often in church life. We haven't often done communication on critical issues well in local church communities. And our imperfections rise to the surface when our emotions are pulled and strained. And that's where in Christian discipleship, we are often challenged about how we will articulate what we're feeling, what we believe should be said in any situation on the basis of what we're feeling, because often we're talking about complex matters. Because that's related to the next cause, which is all about emotions. And what's interesting about this as Pentecostals is that much of the way we exercise our collective acts of worship are about inviting emotion to be part of how we worship. Expressions of joy and celebration, but also even expressions of lament. Part of Christian worship is engaging our emotions, as we see throughout the Psalms, Proverbs, Lamentations, those poetic books in the Bible, which are often a source when we understand what community worship looks like. But there's something about being part of a local Christian community that runs deep for many of us. It's a part of who we are, and our emotions cannot be disengaged from situations that we feel passionately about so very often. And so it's not surprising that emotions can become disproportionate when there are moments of confrontation or conflict. Disappointment, sadness, bitterness, anger, offense are all parts of how we manage our lives. And often emotions, in my experience, are the energy that fuels conflict. If only we could remove emotions and talk factually about something. But if you put a factual person in the room with an emotional person, they're not going to find it easy to deal with something. One will patronize the other, and the other will wind up the one who patronizes him. It just is that clash and combination. And often it's not very human, is it, to stay calm when one's beliefs, views, or actions are being challenged or questioned. And so we see sometimes a combination of these things are what cause conflict. But also we think about values, and that's one that Bernard Mayer uses in this wheel of conflict. Now, values are a much more difficult problem to deal with because in so many ways, they are our deeply held personal perspectives. They're less empirical. In other words, they're less obvious. They're less sensory. They are something that sit within us, that matter to us. And Mayer suggests that values can be described as what distinguishes for us right from wrong, good from evil. We believe this is right. Somebody else believes it's wrong. We believe this is good. Somebody else disagrees with us. We all have our personal set of values. And often the outcome of differing values is when congregations disagree about what the church is or how it ought to be. And so when these things sit deeply within us, when they are challenged, one of the things we realize about Christian community is if our values are challenged, sometimes we feel that we're being attacked. And we can't disassociate our personal feelings from value discussions. But then he also talks about structures. And structures are the way in which a church operates, and it's governed. And much of what I'm saying to you this evening, I'm setting in church context, obviously. And a guy called Van Yperen in one of his books suggested that when we think about structure, we think about what underlines the way we organize, work, lead, and make decisions in organizations, including churches. It's the way things are done around here, how a decision is made, what actions should follow. And these become often the source of conflict in our communities when we disagree about the way something should be done, the way it should be led, who should do it, those structural things. But I want to spend a little bit more time in this section, excuse me, have a little drink. When we think about history as a cause of conflict, I made an interesting discovery when I was working on my thesis, and this was a big part of the topic. And I didn't find in any of the other sources I read that were looking at what are the causes of conflict in church life or in organizations, that many people really talked about history, apart from this guy, Bernard Mayer, because he suggests that a conflict cannot be removed from its historical influences. And when we understand the uniqueness of the Christian church, the antiquity and the historicity of the church, we're thinking about going back thousands and thousands of years. We see actually a journey where the church has ridden a lot of conflict and confrontation over its history in all of its forms. And what Mayer suggests is that conflict cannot be understood independently of its historical context. And I'm going to unpack this a little bit for you in a moment or two. When we think about some of the context of conflict, we think about generational issues when in a church, generations disagree about how things should be. We think about cultural differences that can actually affect the way we see things. And what we're discovering in the church today, generally speaking, is a whole range of cultures in the church generationally. So, as I said, I have a 21-year-old daughter who sees life, she's a follower of Jesus, but she still sees life through a very different prism and angle the way I do. So we sometimes have a little bit of conflict in the home when I see things differently to the way she does. And when she was a little younger and I had a little bit more parental control, when she saw staying out times a little differently to how I saw staying out times, where she saw dress a little differently to how I saw dress. All of those combinations of what I have a historic context for the values that I have, but she's living in a very, very different era. And there are some particular aspects to this context of history I want to unpack for us. Three big factors that I think are true in local church context that can be the source or the cause of conflict. So the first is tradition. None of us like to think our church has too many traditions, but what you find interesting in church contexts is how historic patterns of practice, some people see them almost as biblical patterns of practice. What we have done, we almost want to qualify it. It was good enough for the Apostle Paul, so it's good enough for me. The truth is, any student of church history, if you look at the 21st century church, in practice, I'm not saying in belief, but in practice, we could not be further removed from the Apostle Paul and the first apostles in how they practice. In fact, we couldn't be further removed from the pre-Reformation era of the church and even the early Reformation era, the way we worship. In fact, as a Pentecostal denomination who was birthed in 1915 on the shore over there in the beautiful island of Ireland, we are still even far removed today from what we knew the church was then. And so very often in church life, people have mentally almost applied a biblical norm to what is actually a historic practice that doesn't always have biblical foundations. So matters such as styles of music and the layout of the church building take on far greater consequence because it's the way we like it. One of my fellow national leaders David Campbell, who is a Scotsman with a brilliant perception on life. He comes out with some great stuff. He once said, in terms of styles of worship, we're all allowed our preference, but we're not allowed a prejudice. I want to suggest to you that much of the conflict over worship, what I call the worship wars, has not been about biblical substance, but about preference, about style. I believe that the Lord loves cathedral music and contemporary worship. I don't believe God has a music style. I believe that God looks for worship that is in spirit and in truth. And we have often applied traditional mindsets to such things as worship styles because it's the way we like it. And if we're going to be honest, then say it's the way I like it. But so often in our church story, people are applying it as if it's a biblical norm and as if the Apostle Paul used the redemption hymnal. So that's good enough for me. And that's just one example where tradition can hit us. And there's many others that you think about. But another that I think is unique often to church communities is what I call entitlement. The expectation of privilege or benefit by some who've been in the church for many years. Sometimes they might be significant financial donors who expect that their views or opinions will matter more because of what they've given in time, in money, in energy. And of course, all of that is incredibly important. Our churches have been built on the faithfulness of people who've been there and their families have been there. But actually, it can bring this sense of entitlement that's sometimes not even noticed in a person, that I expect things to be done in a particular way or my voice to be heard louder than somebody who's newer to the church. And that's a factor that can create conflict because it's to do with our historic journey. But this issue of buried disputes, let me give you a bit of background how I came about this. I was beginning to think about the research that I need to do for my dissertation back in November 2019. And it was around the time of the remembrance services in the early parts of that month of November. And my wife Amanda and I were watching the news, the national ITV or BBC news, I forget which one it was. And there was a report about this particular region of southern Belgium and northern France, which is known as the Red Zone. And this dates back to the Great War of 1914 and 1918. Do you know that during that war, there were over 1 billion shells that were fired across the various trenches from the German side to the Allied side, across that part of southern Belgium, Flanders, and northern France. 1 billion shells of differing sizes. At the end of the war, it was estimated that there were 300 million unexploded bombs that lie in those areas under farmland in what were trenches. There is still today in that region of northern France and southern Belgium an area that you cannot go. You're not allowed to walk on it. Number one, the land is so polluted by chemical weapons that were fired back then, it would take 500 years for the land to cleanse itself. But there are still unexploded armaments, not ornaments, they're on your windowsill there, armaments in the ground. People have lost their lives. People who've wandered on there, farmers who've gone on there. And every year there's something that's called the iron harvest. In spring and in autumn, as the ground is moving, special bomb disposal experts who are stationed there will harvest hundreds of tons of armaments. You see some in a couple of the pictures here that were found, and they have to be exploded in a controlled way. And that's still happening today, 2021, millions of unexploded shells. When issues remain unresolved in local church life, they can leave a future explosion for the generation that follows. Back in 1994, when Amanda and I came to Birmingham, I was 28 years old, Get your calculators out and you'll figure out that me and Mark Stone are the same age. I was 28 years old. We came to Birmingham to lead what was then an ECI church called Christian Life Centre. The church had a history of conflict. It was birthed out of a split some 12 years, 11 years before we came. And it had a history of conflict. I trod on so many unexploded bombs in the life of the church in those first few years. I don't know how I didn't blow up. I was just trying to lead the church forward. I was doing what the elders had asked me to do, to bring some change. But I stood on so many issues that were unresolved, not been dealt with. And actually, my first 4 or 5 years were just dealing with so many of those issues, so many of those people, so many of those problems that existed. And I say all of that, and I'm going to pause and take some Q&A on this section if you've got any questions or any comments in a moment. I say all of that to say to you, it is not necessarily the preference to bury disputes. And I would contest that when Jesus was leading the disciples, he didn't bury their disputes. He made them confront them and challenge some of those issues. And confrontation is not ever really desirable, but sometimes it's necessary for us to progress, and we'll build on that in a little while. And so as we think about what are the causes of conflict, go back to that wheel and Mayer's wheel. There can be a number, what he calls a constellation of effects. And there's many more than just around that wheel. But we're just trying to identify what maybe are some of the things. And the first thing to learn about confrontation is you have to understand where the issue is coming from. If you don't know where the issue is coming from, you won't find a way of dealing with it. Maybe we'll pause for a moment, Mark, and just take any comments or Q&A there.
Fantastic. Thanks, Stuart. All right, guys, over to you. So much in that section. Thank you for that, Stuart. Any questions? Give you a moment to gather your thoughts. I have, you were describing there about the tradition, which took me back to when I first went into ministry as well, Stuart. And I remember I was, in fact, Paul's on this call. So I came into ministry with Paul Meiklejohn. He was my senior pastor, and I came on as his assistant, first as elder and then his assistant. And we had to try and transition the church from being quite a traditional church to being someone that was moving forward. And we didn't have a clue, really. Well, he may argue that he knew what he was doing, but I didn't have a clue what I was doing. But one of the things that I remember was someone, I think it was one of our deacons, Paul, if you're on, correct me if I'm wrong. But, you know, we wanted to move the communion table to the side of, from the front of the sanctuary to the side of the sanctuary to allow more room for prayer and ministry at the front. And I always remember him saying, you know, it's in the Bible, that has to be in the front. It's in the Bible, it has to be right there. And we stood on so many unexploded bombs in those early days, trying to intuitively knowing how we wanted to take the church, but not knowing really what we were doing. And we're just dealing with all of these bombs. And the fallout of it was that it led to quite a difficult season, and some people left the church. Is there any way, do you think, that could have been avoided? Or, you know, you're saying there at the end, you know, we need to walk towards, if a leader is wanting to move and transition a church forward, and to deal with some of this stuff, you want to try and keep people content and happy and moving on in God, and you don't want division or confrontation in. But there does come a point where you as a leader, you need to move the church forward. Is there, how would you intuitively know what you have to grasp and what you could leave behind and avoid?
Yeah, I think we all always, as leaders, have to understand what majors are and what minors are. Jim Hunt, who Paul and I will remember well from our time in Bible college, he was one of our lecturers. Paul and I were in college together. He used to say, don't major on the minors and don't minor on the majors. And I think we have to sometimes teach our communities, what are the critical things? What are the things I had to learn in my situation? One of the things I was prepared, excuse the terminology, to have a fight over, and one of the things I weren't prepared to have a fight over. And it was a little bit like in school, there were some things I just wasn't going to fight over. And I think sometimes we have to lovingly teach and remind people there are some things that are of far less significance than we understand. And I'll talk a little bit, Mark, at the end about a positive approach to conflict. But I think that there are some things you have to deal with when they are a spark, and don't let them become a flame. Because if you don't then deal with them when they're a flame, they'll become a fire. And if you don't deal with them when they're a fire, they become a blaze. And I suppose in a situation like that, I would deal with it relationally in the first instance, lovingly, talk to somebody, try to understand them, respect their point of view, but also at the same time, with respecting their point of view, be clear with them as to why I don't believe that that is of such great significance, and that we really don't want to disturb the peace of the church community over the location of a table. But I also understand that some people won't ever see that. If you've got somebody who is going to be contentious, they'll be contentious over something unimportant as much as something important. And ultimately, that situation may only be resolved by a very clear, I don't want to use the word confrontation, by a very clear and direct way of approaching that and making it very aware we're not going to allow that to be a fight in our church. It's one you can have on your own. I'm not fighting you over that. I'm walking away from that.
Yeah, great. Thanks.
I'm not wanting to dread up the past, Mark.
I'm still in counselling.
No, I know I'm still having. But the issue, and it's just to help us, it's a good illustration you use, Mark, is that the actual communion table in question was bigger than the ark, and nobody could get out for ministry or prayer because of the size of this. It took us about 6 to lift it. Now, and so when we were trying to deal with that conflict, we were trying to manage that people coming forward for ministry were more important than that location. And Stuart, bless you. I mean, there's some really, really vital things there. And I go back to the point that Mark picked up on, that a lot of our preferences or prejudices, we really do think that it either, well, one or two things, that it is in the Bible or God is on our side. God thinks the same as us. And it's difficult for me to know when, as a pastor, because it's easy for me to accuse my congregation of reading into the text. But I've grown up Elim as well, and as leaders, we're in danger of doing it sometimes ourselves. So it's knowing when to fight our battles and knowing when something is right. But bless you, Stuart, it was an excellent first half of your talk.
Thank you, Paul.
Excellent.
Mark, it's just really a comment. Ken here, Stuart, nice to meet you. And I really enjoyed that first half. I have lived and worked with conflict all my life. History, politics, religion, and tradition. Right down to where people, want to walk a certain road on a certain day, and they will literally die over those things. And bringing my outside experience, and I suppose where I come from is mostly in the area of conflict resolution. But whenever I look at the church and work within the church, I see that there is so much opportunity for conflict and for confrontation with young pastors, because young pastors, and I'm talking about pastors in their early 20s, mid-20s, who practically leave school, go off to college, study for 3 or 4 years, get a theology degree, and then they are MIT. And I'm not sure, and you can inform me about the amount of conflict teaching or conflict resolution teaching that's given to them within the college, because many of them, and I've seen it myself, simply do not know how to deal with confrontation. And they're expected these days to be pastors, bankers, auditors, accountants, human resource managers. All of this is expected of our pastors. And the truth of it is, our pastors are none of those things. Many of our pastors are skilled, wise people. But many of our younger people are not those things, and they do need help with this. Is that your experience, Stuart?
Ken, I'll first say I think that's absolutely right, what you're saying. I've been there. I came into ministry at 21. So I kind of sat both sides of the fence. I felt the challenge, and if I can say it respectfully, the intimidation sometimes of having to lead everybody who seems to be much older than me. Yeah. I was very blessed in both the churches I led as the lead pastor to have not just older and mature people who understood me. You are quite right. In fact, one of the things I'll say in my talk as we progress, one guy observes that so little is done in terms of training people in terms of conflict resolution. I actually do teach a course in the Bible College myself on this material, and I don't think any of my MITs are on this. They're probably not. But this material in a different form, we taught at the MIT conference last year. And I'm committed to doing that, Ken, because I do not believe that all conflict is the result of bad elders, deacons, or church members. Some conflict is the result of bad leaders, leaders who lack security, who feel threatened, and I am committed to try to help people develop those skills. I kind of had to learn on the hoof, but I was grateful for the wisdom of people like Gordon Neal, who was an immense wisdom in my life. And had some very strong leaders. I had a couple who were very were quite bullying. And I learned a lot of this on the hoof. But you're quite right, Ken. We need to prepare our leaders for this. I would also implore those of you who are elders and deacons and you have a young pastor, understand that some things are only learned through life experience. When I came to the church I led for many years with a great degree of blessing, thank God, they would not have ordinarily accepted a young pastor. I was 28. But they'd had a leadership day with Jeff Lucas about a month before my name was presented to them, where they described the minister they wanted. And obviously he was Superman with a dog collar and a Bible under his arm. Jeff Lucas gave them this counsel: I think what you need is a young leader who you're prepared to grow with. And the most senior of those leaders told me that it was that made them consider me. And I think we grew together. I made mistakes. They were gracious. I learned the power of an apology. I say to every leader in this call, particularly the pastors, learn the power of an apology, because I would rather choose to eat humble pie than be force-fed humble pie. And I would rather say, I don't think it's the slightest bit of weakness. I think it's very powerful to say, I'm sorry, I got that wrong. I'm sorry, I didn't understand what you said. I'm sorry, I spoke to you out of turn. And I had a number of occasions I did that. And actually, I felt that my leaders were far more respectful of me being honest that I'd made a mistake. But I do think it's a balance, Ken. Yes, I think young leaders are going to have to learn through some mistakes. Yeah. We will continue to be committed to training our leaders, because I don't think it's going to get better the way that the world that we're in.
No, thank you, Stuart, for that. I agree with that, but it is important. And you're right, an apology 9 times out of 10 will completely and absolutely take the situation away and defuse the situation. Thank you, Stuart.
You're welcome, Ken.
Stuart, I'm sorry to having jumped in twice when there's other people, but can I just ask you a question? I mean, in terms of our sort of postmodern culture, your opinion is your opinion and my opinion is my opinion, and you don't have the right to challenge my opinion anymore. And I think that has been a change that I've seen more in the last 10 years of my ministry. You may have wanted to touch upon it later, but it's increasingly difficult to challenge people of a particular social narrative, simply because you don't have a right to tell me that I'm doing anything wrong. And I don't know if that's worth you opening up a little bit.
In the final section, Paul, I will talk a little bit about when I give some tools for a positive approach to conflict of handling that. But I would say this: we also have to recognize that we have not set the boundaries in many ways for who we are as the Church of Jesus Christ. He set them. And at the heart of that is a lifestyle of humility and self-sacrifice and giving. Okay. But at the heart of that also are values and principles that, whether we are comfortable with them or not, they exist. And I suppose that's always going to create challenges, Paul. I think you're absolutely right. You know, the postmodern, the latest generation, beyond the millennials, whatever it's called now, there is a narrative that I will hold to my particular point of view, and you can't tell me I'm wrong. But ultimately, I think that as part of the body of Christ, we all accept we're part of a bigger narrative, which is a set of biblical principles and standards we're all called to live by. And they're being challenged at every angle, which is a whole other topic you probably covered in the cultural aspects of in recent weeks, and things that Malcolm will probably touch on in a lot what he presents. But at the same time, Paul, I think that we can't step away from declaring what we believe to be true. For me, Jesus came from Jesus, John chapter 1, Jesus came from the Father full of grace and truth. And I think there is a way of being truthful, but also showing grace at the same time. I don't have to shy away from the truth as long as I'm also armed with grace. And there are, the good old British cliches. We're just going to have to agree to differ. And sometimes, in my leadership, leading teams, we had to agree to differ. I didn't hold the upper hand; they didn't. We're just going to see it differently. It came down to, it was my responsibility to see something through. So, hey guys, we're going to have to agree to differ. I'm going to give it my best shot. Hopefully, you'll go with me on it. And I think that one thing I learned was, the more I learned how to deal with difficult situations, the more the leaders around me were prepared to go with me on them. And that just took time.
Yes, sure, thank you.
Wonderful.
I think Roy's got his hand up.
Yeah, Stuart, really enjoying the ministry and the question time. But I suppose from what I want to put into this question time is that, we all make mistakes. And I love that phrase that we have to learn the power of apology. I think that's absolutely brilliant. But, sometimes young pastors go into churches. We're all on a learning curve. We all have to do communication better. We all have to, that whole phrase, we need, my wife, Hillary, she often says to me, you've got to deal with conflict with love and grace. And sometimes twice as much love and twice as much grace as you normally would exercise in any area of life. But I'm thinking of some of our younger guys coming into a well-established church with older leaders who are quite entrenched in their ways. And, it's a frightening situation for some of our, sometimes even as an older leader, walking into walking cold into an environment where there are very intelligent men and women, but sometimes there are those that love to intimidate the pastoral leader. And it's difficult to navigate through that whole process where there may be one or two in a church session or in a church that want to dictate their ways, want to intimidate the pastor or the leader, and normally it flows out of a situation where they want to get their own way, and it's a carnal situation where they want to put everyone else down. I know that there's no easy answers to that, but what sort of wisdom could you give to someone a little bit younger going into a very intimidating situation?
I'll give the same wisdom that we'll finish with later tonight in terms of my talk. Later tonight not being 11 o'clock, by the way, just to encourage you, where the Apostle Paul says to a young leader, Timothy, 2 Timothy 4:5, you keep your head in all situations. I think when you face a situation like that, it becomes about, it's spiritual. And I don't mean spiritual in a negative sense. I think it's about each one of us as leaders. So it's about the younger leader in your hypothesis there, Roy, who says, I'm going to conduct myself in a fashion that would honor the Lord, whatever happens. I was in that situation in the church I led with two different individuals over probably the first 10 years of my time in the church. I was there for 22 years, who at different times tried to bully me. I learned something from Dennis Phillips, who was the first pastor I served with, who wouldn't confront any situation really. I thought he wasn't confronting it. And I used to say to him, you need to say something, you need to say something. Until I realized that the times he'd thrown me his car keys and asked me to drop his wife at the supermarket, he was on his face before God. That's where he was confronting it. There are some things you confront in a higher court than the elders' meeting. Something you go to the one person who's able to do things. And Dennis taught me, when I was particularly aggrieved at somebody saying something about me, Stuart, it's the Lord that justifies us. And I had to realize I sometimes don't have to fight back. I just have to get on my face before God. And I did that with these two individual guys who at times in elders' meetings would just have a go at me, or sometimes in front of other people. And I felt intimidated. But I would sometimes just go before God and say, God, I just want you to deal with this. And he did. Now, that's not a simplistic answer. We must never see working with the Spirit as just a simplistic answer. Well, let's just pray about it. However, I learned in that journey, there was a time for me and that person to sit down, and I could tell you lots of different stories, and for me to actually say, I'm not putting up with this any longer. I'm sorry, this is unrighteous behavior. But I think what I would say practically in our Elim structures, and you're there, Roy, and Alistair's on the call as well, as members of the ILT, that's what we're there for as a movement. And I think sometimes we need third-party intervention. We need to call the wisdom of somebody else in, whether it's a member of the ILT, whether it's a colleague over here, whether it's national leadership team. Sometimes a conflict situation needs third-party intervention, because it's got beyond where two people or a group of people can manage it. And I would say the strength of being part of a movement like Elim is that the local church sometimes doesn't have any choice about intervention. If we believe that intervention, and I've been a member of the national leadership team for 16 years, and we have on a number of occasions said it's time for us to step in now and to intervene. And sometimes that's to protect the church. Sometimes that's to protect the individuals. So I think you're right, Roy. There is no easy answer. But I think, first of all, we approach things with a godly spirit and before the Lord. Secondly, we sometimes have to confront it individually with someone. And thirdly, it's a little bit Matthew 18. You go and talk to them. They won't listen to you. You take someone with you. They won't listen to you. You bring it to the church. There's a context, I think, that works for us as denomination in that as well.
Stuart, we have a couple of comments in the chat, and Samson is wondering if there's a point at which we have to disagree because, there are fundamentals that we have to agree. And then Samuel is saying that sometimes whenever you confront, it doesn't go well and you end up feeling guilty. And then what can one do to get rid of guilt?
Well, I think there's only one way you ever get rid of guilt, and that's, we were never called to be guilty. There's one who died for our guilt. I think as long as we're acting, again, to all of us as Christian leaders, there is a standard that's set for us in the scriptures about our life and our conduct, really. And ultimately, I can have confidence before God if my heart is right before God. But if I am reacting, if I am confronting a situation out of my own personal self-interest, then I'm actually going beyond what is God's design for me as a leader. I learned many years ago that the shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. And I apologize for things I never said or did because it was saving the sheep from being hurt. And sometimes, the good shepherd steps in. But I think that if you're feeling guilty because you feel you've done something right, you can only ever take that to the foot of the cross. That's where guilt belongs, at the foot of the cross. you open your heart before the Lord, said, Lord, you know my heart, you know my motives. The greatest thing to understand is our motives, because I can surround the idea to confront someone and let them know what I think with all kinds of spiritual language, but there's one who judges the thoughts and intents of our heart. You know, I'm reading Hebrews at the moment, read Hebrews 4:15 the other day. The word of God is living and active, sharper than a double-edged sword. It judges and pierces the intents and the motives of a man's heart. I want to be able, in a conflict situation, as best as I can, to say, Lord, I'm going to do what is right by you. And if that means I have to apologize, so be it. But if that means I have to step forward and say, no, I'm sorry, this is wrong, your behavior is wrong. As I'll say in a moment, in the next section, I'll give you some guidance on how we do that. But I think it's important that we keep our heart right before God, because at the end of the day, we will give an answer to him for the opportunities. Leadership is an opportunity and a responsibility, and I want to use it well. So I would say to Samuel, don't feel guilt if you feel you've done the right thing. Take it to the Lord. Other people have no right to load us with guilt.
I'm sure you've got a lot more you want to say, Stuart, but you've clearly touched on something that people feel quite strongly about. So we have another comment here that's just asking, what about a situation where the church is ready to move on, but the leadership of the church wants to maintain the church as it is?
Sure. Well, it's very difficult, isn't it, when the people who should be leading the church on want to keep it as it is. And, you know, but that becomes, again, a value decision, a value judgment, because the leaders who don't want to move on have a certain set of values that are different to the people who want to move on. Over whatever that might be, it doesn't necessarily fall about worship styles. It can be all kinds of things. And I think in a situation like that, it becomes very difficult for a church community to know a real sense of unity. And that's where I think there needs to be third-party involvement. That's where, as part of a movement like Elim, having the involvement of those who lead, whether it's there in the Irish setting with the ILT and Edwin, somebody coming in to arbitrate. A little bit like Ken was saying earlier, there are some situations you will not resolve between two people who see things quite differently. And I think there are, in that situation, far more skilled resolution skills become necessary, because there's no winners in that.
Thank you, Stuart.
Wonderful.
Can we move on, Mark? Maybe cover a bit more ground. I think it will open some stuff up.
Absolutely. Great session there, but over to you, Stuart.
Thank you. I want to move on and talk a little bit now about levels of conflict. And I don't know how many of you like a particular restaurant that specialises in chicken. Any Nando fans, give me a wave. My daughter is a huge Nando's fan. But there are different levels of conflict and confrontation. I want you to understand, really. And I developed this. It's called the conflict periometer. And if you go to a Nando's, you'll have a choice of how hot you will have your chicken. Now, I've got to confess to you, I rarely go beyond the green sections. I quite like the lime one. And I'm a bit of a lightweight when it comes to my children, but none of them ever really hit the extra hot. I live in Birmingham, and we are the curry capital, I think, sometimes of the UK, but I still can only manage a medium one. But a guy called Speed Lees, in a book he wrote about conflict and controversy, suggests that there may be 5 levels of conflict. We're starting at the bottom of this diagram, moving up. There are predicaments. Now, a predicament is probably just an unpleasant difficulty. It's quite mild. It's a little bit of a problem to solve. It probably is, you know, Paul and Mark's illustration of the communion table, though for me, I would have moved it 6 inches every Sunday. And after 10 weeks, it would have been well out the way, don't worry. And, you know, they wouldn't have even noticed 6 inches of Sunday, but that's how I would have done it. But there are some predicaments. They're just things that we need to resolve. They're low-lying challenges. But then there are disagreements. And in a disagreement, there's a stronger element of dissent. We see things very differently. It's not just a little problem we've got to solve. We're starting to see things differently. And people almost take sides. I see it this way. You see it that way. But it can just still be quite mild, and we've got conversations to have to move forward. But then when we move up a little bit, we get a bit hotter into contests. The thing about contests is that winning and losing is what a contest is all about. Coming out on top, winning the fight, winning the battle is really what it's about. And what tends to happen is the original problem gets lost as people start to articulate their disagreements, and it becomes layered. So the moment we move from the original problem into what we think about the original problem, we then start to discover we don't agree about what we think about the original problem, which means we don't, and it becomes a layered thing that becomes progressive, and the original problem gets lost, but it becomes a more intense heat, if you like, of conflict. And then we have fights where hostilities are much more obvious, and combatants aim verbal and emotional punches designed to hurt. I'm sorry to have to tell you, in my experience as a national leader in Elim, I've come across this, where people are out to hurt one another, God's people out to hurt one another. None of us want to believe that the church could be like this, but many of us have seen it, and some of us have even experienced it, and it becomes a hot situation. But then at the extreme end of conflict is kind of all-out war. And we've reached the limit, really. Here, it feels like utter destruction is what people are trying to achieve. In fact, a guy called Alistair Mackay suggested at this level, perhaps it's better referred to as holy war, since the conflict is out of the participants' control, and the goal of opposing parties is to destroy one another. When I came to the church I led, not long after being here, I was told a story about a not too distant conflict, probably about 3 years before I came, where such was the battle that a group of people stood on the steps outside the church and they called for the local press to come because they wanted the pastor sacked, and if necessary, the church closed. I was just glad it didn't happen in my day, because I was way too inexperienced to know how to handle that. But that was something of the scene that I faced. And one thing I've learned about conflict resolution is, like all kinds of escalation, the earlier you can deal with the predicament, the better. When you have a spark, try to put out the spark, because if you don't, if it has enough fuel, it will turn into a flame. A flame is more difficult to extinguish than a spark, but if you don't, the flame will become a fire. And if you allow enough fuel to touch the fire, it becomes a blaze. And in team leadership, there was a situation I had many years ago where I overlooked some niggling little things that were one of my assistants was doing it was irritating me at first, but it just grew and grew. And unfortunately, it escalated to us having some very strong words with each other. And afterwards, when I realized what had happened, I had to go back to him and say, you know what? I should have handled those situations much earlier. And my advice when we think about the levels of conflict is try to address something as early, as relationally as you can, before it gets way out of control for anybody to deal with. I want to talk to you for a little while about healthy conflict. Now, it is not an oxymoron. How can conflict ever be healthy? Well, I want to suggest to you that it is important to see conflict in this way. Look at this quote that I've got here from a guy called James Schellenberg. Wouldn't like to actually ask for a taxi over the phone with that name, would you? He says this, that conflict is so fully a part of all forms of society that we should appreciate its importance for stimulating new thoughts, for promoting social change, for defining our group relationships, for helping us from our own sense of personal identity, and for many other things we take for granted in our everyday lives. I had a bit of a revelation a couple of years ago that there are 1,189 chapters in the Bible, but only 4 chapters where there's no conflict. That's the first 2 and the last 2. Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. By the time we get to Genesis 3, we have the fall. We have conflict between creation, the created, and the creator. And then the human story is conflict all the way, human battles between one another, the spiritual battle that's taking place, all the way through to the last 2 chapters of the Bible, where we see the New Jerusalem, the city of God, coming to be the kingdom, the eternal kingdom. And actually, that's the reality of human experience, conflict. Now, my wife is just 2 walls away from me, and I love her dearly, but we've been married for, how long is it now? Yeah, I do know. It's 33 years next year. But in real terms, we have had moments where there's been conflict. Not always rows, not always shouting at each other. There have been predicaments, disagreements, and contests along the way. Don't think about many fights or wars, thank God. But actually, disagreements don't need to lead to a war. They can lead to progress. And I think that if I can speak to those of us who are leaders, particularly who are pastors and church leaders, many of us struggle with any form of critical perception of ourselves. We are by nature, as local church leaders, some of the more insecure individuals that there are, because so much of what church is relates to who we are and our leadership. And we can often feel, and there's this kind of this sense of agreement that we can share with one another, that what we do and what we're saying is not always being appreciated. And we struggle sometimes to understand that some criticism is not necessarily that bad. I haven't got the quote, but I'm reminded of a little book by Jamie Buckingham called Coping with Criticism, in which he says that the most difficult thing for church leaders is when they realize that in all criticism, there is usually some truth. And that's a difficult place for us to be, actually, as leaders. And healthy conflict can sometimes create tension, what we call friction. And we think that friction is a term we use about human relationships, but it's a scientific term. And if you think about the laws of friction, there is never any progress without friction. We had a little bit of a snowfall here in Birmingham, the early weekend, and my neighbour Lee, who we get on with really well, just over the road in our cul-de-sac, was out clearing the snow, and I was having to take Amanda to work. She didn't really want to drive in the snow. And I'm so glad that my tyres got some friction with the road. If my tyres had not got friction with the road, we'd not get anywhere. Sometimes we have to understand that a necessary amount of friction will help us to progress. The scientific principle of friction means that the most important thing to recognize is controlling the heat, because friction allows progress, but too much heat in the friction can be destructive. Let's take a little drink if you don't mind. And as local church leaders, we sometimes have to be honest about our churches, the health and the state of our churches. And a leader who is insulated from honest analysis is not in a healthy position. I thank God that over the years, I've had friends in ministry, I've had local church leaders who were able to say to me, I'm not sure you're right there, Stuart. I'm not sure that was the right thing to say. I remember one particular instance where we were in an elders meeting and I'd raised a concern about one of my assistants who wasn't in the meeting. It was just to alert the elders that I was dealing with a situation. And one of the elders went off on a tangent with a huge criticism of this person. It was way over the top. And I found myself disagreeing with him vehemently. And we got in a bit of a slanging match over it. We were really having a go at it. And in the end, one of the elders calmed it down. The next day, my finance officer, a godly man, phoned me up and said, Stuart, I think you were out of order last night. And I said, hang on a second, what about Paul? He was the one. He said, yeah, but Stuart, you're the leader. You're the person we thought would measure the atmosphere of the meeting. And it kind of cut across my spirit. I thought, he's right. And that was one moment I learned the power of apology. But actually, the ability that he had to speak into my life helped me to be in a better place. Now, there's a great Christian writer called Patrick Lencioni, and he's written a book called The Advantage. It's a leadership book. And he talks about what he calls the conflict continuum. And I want to show you this diagram here, and you can see my mouse hopefully on the screen. He suggests that there is a kind of a spectrum when it comes to conflict that we all live on in church life. There is what we call artificial harmony. Now, we're really good at this as churches. What we say is, oh, brother, great to see you. We all get on. It's wonderful. It's lovely. But actually, under our breath and in our minds, we're not in agreement. But nobody ever says anything. Nobody ever says they disagree. Nobody ever addresses any issues. Nobody ever is honest. At the other end of the spectrum, we find mean-spirited personal attacks, where there's just such a bitter, nasty, awful atmosphere. He suggests that, if you like, part of this on this conflict continuum is constructive, but part is destructive. But here, right just before the centre, is what he calls the ideal conflict point. And what he means by this is that here in this positive side, constructive side, people can be honest and frank and candid, but at the same time, polite and respectful. So I'm glad to see my friend Paul Micklejohn's on the call, so I'll use him as illustration. We've been friends for years, we worked together. It's as if, I'm saying to Paul, Paul was looking for a church building a few years ago. We were working on that together. As if I went and said, Paul, why are you looking at this building, mate? This is rubbish. This isn't going to work for you. This is, it's the difference to me saying that and saying, Paul, you're an absolute idiot. I'm over here then, what are you doing? You've lost your senses. What kind of a leader are you? There's the ability for me to give Paul an honest appraisal. And it's there might be some friction there. Paul, as an Elim leader, why would you be taking us into that building, etc.? That may not be the best illustration. What he says is, and I'll cover this in my final section in a few minutes, the whole opportunity to be candid and honest without it tipping over into terminology, insults, personal attack. Actually, this is a very helpful place to be, because honesty is part of constructive conflict. We can challenge issues appropriately. We can address attitudes correctly. We can identify failings positively. And when conflict is a healthy thing, when there's a sense of friction, yes, but we're dealing with issues, there is sometimes a sense of energy in that friction. That's what friction does. It creates energy that helps progress. Paul Avis, who wrote the book Authority, Leadership and Conflict in the Church, says there are a number of things that positive conflict, healthy conflict, can bring to an organization or a church. It gives vitality. It can open up the system to its environment. There's such a thing as organizational blindness in the business world. They talk about organizational blindness. Sometimes we don't want to admit there's a problem. And as a leader, so often we are really close to the issues of the church and what we want. And sometimes there's not the opportunity for a much more objective view of whether we're getting it right. If we never allow a broader view than what's happening in our leadership meeting, then actually we can sometimes be organizationally blind to the realities of what people are feeling and expressing. I think one of the most critical things as church leaders is listen to the sheep. Listen to people. You don't always have to take on board everything you hear or do everything that's suggested. But why not listen for that kind of openness? He says we can clarify the true interests of the organization. We can correct imbalances, but sometimes we stimulate reform and renewal. When we look at any Reformation movement, any renewal movement, there was conflict, there was friction. We go back to the 16th century and to Martin Luther. His conflict with the Catholic Church of the day led to a Reformation across Europe. If we look to any movement, John Wesley, who was strangely touched by the Lord, there was conflict with the church of the day, but there was a revival across our land. Even in the earliest days of our Elim movement, the way that our founders led and the moving of the Spirit brought us into conflict. Conflict can be a positive thing. Sometimes there are things that just have to change. sometimes there are things that just have to be addressed. And I'll come on in just a few moments to the how, because I think maybe you might be thinking about that. If we want to move forward, then we will experience friction. Let me cover my last little bit and then we can do some more question and answers, because I want to talk about a positive approach to conflict. And here's where I want to get really practical with you and give you some advice, if I may, a bit further advice. First of all, this quote from Michael Hare: conflict, as painful as it is, provides a transformational opportunity like few others, both for church leaders and for their congregations. The bad news is that not many churches seize this golden opportunity, instead allow disagreement and division to do tremendous damage. I want to give you 5 headlines. They're not exhaustive, but things that I've learned actually, I think, can help us have a positive approach to conflict. The number one, and this is right at the top of the list, the number one thing: build trust and relationships. Ken asked a brilliant question earlier about young leaders, and I'm privileged to work with our MITs. That's a big part of what I do. 90 ministers in training across Elim. One of the big bits of advice I give to them is focus on positive relationships with your leaders and the people in the church. The stronger the bond of relationship in leadership teams or between the leader and their people in the good times, the easier it will be to hold together in the bad times. Do you know that someone, it's not here on those, but someone once said that trust is a little bit, grows like a thermometer, but is turned off like a light switch. It takes time for trust to grow, but it can be gone in a moment. And trust is the basis of every meaningful human relationship, between a father and a mother and their children, between a husband and wife, between friends, between leaders. And what's really important is building positive relationships. And let me give you a little illustration. Many years ago, one of our Elim leaders in New Zealand was preaching at our conference. And he told the story about the fact that he was going out to the church one morning in the week to carry out his ministry. And his wife said to him, "Darling, on your way home tonight, could you pick up some flowers and a birthday card? It's my mom's birthday. We'll call around tonight with some flowers and a card and wish her happy birthday." He shot off. He had a busy day. He came home and he'd forgotten. How many husbands have done that? Forgotten the little task their wife asked them to do. When he got home and he'd forgotten, his wife exploded on him. She was furious. She was so upset. And he thought, this is so out of character. What's going on here? What's this about? When they began to discuss what had happened and it calmed down their disgust, he realized it wasn't that one thing that he'd forgotten to do, but there were so many little occasions he hadn't invested in their relationship. He'd not built something. And he said, it's a little bit like going to the cash point. If you visit the cash point every day and take money out without making any deposits into the bank, eventually the cash point will say insufficient funds. Some conflict happens when leaders keep taking in their leadership relationships and not depositing in, not connecting, not having a coffee out with one of their fellow leaders, not encouraging people, not showing concern when that leader's wife is in hospital or their kids having a difficult time. The more we invest in our relationships, the more we can take out of it in the tough times. And that's true in any kind of relationship. So I would really encourage you, build trust and relationships. The stronger the bond of relationships in a leadership team or between a leader and the people they're leading, the easier it is to actually navigate conflict situations. The second I would suggest to you is to encourage healthy disagreement. And this comes back to something Paul was saying in his question a little earlier, because it's not something we naturally do. Sometimes as leaders, we just want everybody to agree with us. We don't want those situations where we're discussing something and we disagree. I would say that building a positive approach to conflict is actually building a cultural value into our leadership teams where we give people the freedom and the opportunity to disagree. Because if we don't allow that, open the door for people to express what they're thinking, sometimes they'll kick down the door when they really need to say what they're feeling. And there's a brilliant book I'd recommend to you called High Impact Teams by Lance Witt. And he's got a chapter and it's simply called Getting Comfortable with Uncomfortable Conversations. And that's sometimes, I think, what it takes to develop really good teams of leaders, really good leadership situations, really good leadership environments, that we can actually sometimes have the difficult conversations in the right atmosphere where we've dealt with our own insecurities and they're not exposed in the heat of disagreement, where we can hold our tongue and speak in an appropriate fashion, but we can actually encourage people to disagree with us. I was in a Zoom meeting today with a couple of NLT colleagues and we're working on a particular project together. And I actually said to them, guys, I know this is something that I've really committed to and I've put a lot of thought and effort into. I want you to tell me if I'm wrong in this. I want you to pick it to pieces. If you think that I've missed something here, if you think there's another angle, please tell me. And we had a really good, healthy, robust conversation where they didn't quite see things from the same angle as I did. And it was really, really positive. And I think it's important for us as pastors, those in the core of pastors, in your leadership teams, your deacons, your elders, encourage healthy disagreement. Allow people the opportunity early on to say if they're not sure, if they disagree with something or other. And I think that's really important. You see, without diverse opinions, you've not really got a team. You haven't got a team if people just nod with artificial harmony. Yes, Pastor. Yes, Pastor. Okay, whatever you say. That's not agreement. And that's actually going to hit a crisis at some point down the road because somebody will have enough. They'll be fed up of nodding like a Churchill dog in the back of someone's car, just constantly nodding. And they're eventually going to say, I've had enough of this. And the expression then of the disagreement becomes unhealthy because it's not being periodically healthy. But also look for the early warning signs. See, approaching conflict in a positive way will involve being proactive. Some leaders, just as I have on occasions, ignore the early warning signs. I don't really want to say anything. I don't want to cause any trouble. I don't want to address anything. But actually, sometimes there are early warning signs that a problem is brewing, a conflict is growing, a situation is potentially going to get out of hand. And in his book, Emotionally Healthy Church, Peter Scazzaro gives some examples of what these early warning signs might be. When somebody's withdrawing from meetings, you know, they haven't turned up at a few meetings and not told you, unannounced absences. We haven't seen them for weeks on a Sunday. What's going on? Erratic or unusual behaviour. You know, they walked past me on Sunday and didn't even say hello. It's not them. They don't normally do that. Sharp or impolite emails. Have you found that some people can be really strong in their emails? Emails are a very dangerous tool. Please don't ever try to resolve a conflict with a text, a WhatsApp, or an email. You can't resolve a conflict with a one-dimensional piece of communication. It just will never work. In fact, it becomes fuel. You may as well take the paper off your printer and put it like fuel into the conflict. Or somebody's making unusually negative comments or feedback. You think, hang on a second, they don't seem to have a positive word tonight or the last couple of meetings we had together. Emotive outbursts, angry outbursts, or little groups of people forming. What Peter Scazzaro is trying to show is that there are some signs, and we as leaders need to be more proactive, early stage response. What are some of the signs? Maybe it's an arm around someone's shoulder. Hey, we've missed you recently. Is there a problem? Do you want, you okay? And they say there is, or do you want to have a chat? Do you want to have a coffee and talk about it? Just a couple more things before I wrap up and we have a few questions before we go into groups. I think it's important to establish the rules of engagement. I don't know of many churches that have done this, that as a group of leaders have sat down and said, if we have a problem in the future, how do you think we should address it? What's the process we're going to go through? What's the way in which we will deal with conflict? What are the rules we're going to put in play for dealing with a problem that we're all going to agree to now? Because normally the way problems are dealt with in a church, conflict, is a kind of combination of the traditions and the attitudes, the behaviours and the habits from the past. In my first year of being in the church that I was here in Birmingham, a strong group of leaders who loved nothing more than having a good row with each other. And I used to sit sometimes thinking, what is it with these guys? And there was one particular night where two guys were having a real row with each other. And it was over some carpet, believe it or not, that had been put in one of the offices. One thought that the other should have let him know, and it was crazy. And I probably let it go on too long in many ways, but one of the guys, he was on the edge of his seat. I thought, he's going to storm out. He's going to storm out. Now, I don't believe that's the way you deal with things. I wouldn't storm out of a meeting. My own response would not be that. I remember saying to him, his name was Brian, please don't storm out. We need to resolve this now, find a way. Come on, guys. And he got up to go, and I said, Brian, come and see me tomorrow, please, as he left the room. Well, this guy was in his he was just turned 60. I was 28, 29. Came to my office the next day, and I told him that I was very unhappy. That wasn't the way we should be doing meetings. It didn't show grace. There'd been enough of that in this church's history. And he looked at me and he said, I feel you're talking to me like I'm a child. Do you know, to my absolute shame, before I realised what I was saying, I'd said to him, well, behave like a child and I'll treat you like a child. Behave like an adult and I'll treat you like an adult. You know, when you've said something, oh, dear me, I don't know if I should have said that. But he laughed. He thought it was hilarious. And we had a real good, robust discussion. I actually said to him, Brian, I need your help. I need your help to say that this is the way, we're not going to do meetings like this. This is not how we're going to engage one. And I need your support, because the next time that happens, I want you to say, okay, guys, we shouldn't be doing it like this. It took time, but over time, we were able to establish that we weren't going to storm out. We weren't going to behave like that. And actually, one Christian writer has suggested, you know, that you need to have some rules, things like no personal attacks. It's on the notes. No talking about people behind their backs. We're not going to have aggressive physical gestures when we're talking, because, you know, body language is everything, isn't it? No refusal to talk or engage. I'm not talking to you. Nothing to do with you. No name calling. And I believe that Matthew 18, which I referenced earlier in our question and answer, is Jesus setting rules of engagement for the disciples. Listen, if somebody offends you, fella, you should go and talk to them about it and see if you can sort it out. If you can't sort it out, then you take a trusted friend with you and see if you can sort it out. If then you can't do it, you go to the church. And I think Jesus was saying, let's have some rules of engagement. And Ken Sande, who's a Christian writer from the States, in an article in Christianity Today, suggested that we should actually say to our teams, listen, we may have a falling out someday. If that happens, what will we do? Because failure to have accountability structures in place before a conflict most frequently is the most frequent issue we deal with in conflicts between leaders, pastors, elders, deacons, people at every level. Maybe your church session could actually say, how would we deal with it? What would be the steps we would take? What are the rules of engagement? My kind of final point this evening. Respond appropriately and proportionately. Right at the beginning, I used a diagram about 4 different ways of dealing with conflict, you know, to react, to retreat, to respond, you know, those kinds of things. I want to suggest you one lesson I learned, and that is that the difference between a reaction and a response is probably about 48 hours. Because I've had people come to me after a Sunday service and have a go at me. And if I'd reacted at that moment, it would have been very damaging to a lot of innocent onlookers. I've got a very wise wife who's the opposite of personality to me. We're great contrast to one another. We gel well. And she will be the one that says, Stu, don't say anything, just leave it a couple of days. And I learned that the difference between running towards a conflict, reacting, and walking towards it can just be a couple of days. A couple of days to pray. A couple of days to let my emotions settle. A couple of days to let the Spirit generate something, a bit more of God's grace in my life. A couple of days to pick up the phone to a trusted friend or my regional leader or somebody I know will give me good advice. A couple of days to even plan, how am I going to approach that situation? One of these guys who was a problem to me in my early years, and I'm friends with him all these years on, is a great guy. He once confronted me at the end of a service, and I felt he made me look an absolute fool. And I was fuming. I went home upset. The next day was my day off, and it spoiled my day off. And I phoned Gordon Neal, my regional leader, who's got this kind of erstwhile type of advice he gives to us. Gordon said, you need to go and talk to the guy. Well, I went. Have you ever been driving to have a conversation, and you're having the conversation you're going to have in the car on the way? I mean, it was a 5-minute journey from my office, but I knew I was lined up. I got it. I was going to nail him. He wasn't going to get out of this. I had my thumb. I was going to. And I parked outside his house deliberately 5 minutes early so he could see my car there. That was my motive and my attitude. And the Spirit said to me, Stuart, say sorry. And I knew it was the Spirit because all of my adrenaline, everything inside of me felt conflicted. And anyway, long story short, I eventually went and knocked his door. I said to him, hey, before we say anything, I just want to apologize. That was where I first learned the power of apology. The whole situation diffused. We sat down, had a reasonable conversation. Now, it doesn't always pan out like that, but it was about the difference between a reaction and a response. And the church is called to be a redemptive community. And sometimes confrontation is what's necessary to bring redemption. Sometimes loving someone enough to be honest with them is the way to redeem a situation. And as I said just a few moments ago, I think of the words of the Apostle Paul, who said to Timothy, but you keep your head in all situations, endure hardship. It's not easy in a conflict situation where you feel wronged. Do the work of an evangelist, discharge all the duties of your ministry. Whilst we may want to run away and hide from conflict, can I suggest to you that if we can find the right way to deal with these things, it may not always go exactly as we would like, but just if 50%, 60%, 75% of the situations we have to deal with went much better, then ultimately everybody in the kingdom environment wins. And that's about us as leaders learning what it takes for us to align our hearts and spirits with the Spirit of God, but at the same time, approaching situations as Jesus would, full of grace and truth. Thank you, Mark.
Stuart, thank you so much. I think just looking at the comments of people just responding throughout that talk, top shelf stuff, incredibly practical, full of wisdom and experience. I am conscious of time. We are hitting the 9 o'clock mark, but there is so much there to unpack. And so I think Q&A over to you guys. Make use of the time. If you have questions, now is your opportunity to bring them, or comments or thoughts that you have. Over to you. We're all thinking.
Stuart, I'm not sure, Ken again, sorry for jumping in, but it might get the conversation flowing. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of the Kelling's broken window theory. And it really was born out of inaction. It's to do with law and order. And one thing I would always say in terms of resolving conflict or noticing conflict is use your emotional intelligence. You know, we can tell, as the Bible says, we can tell when it's going to rain. We can tell when the skies are getting dark. We can tell when the sun's going to shine. We've all been given a gift of emotional intelligence, and that's our early warning sign that something is wrong. And the most important thing I've found in my experience over many, many years is early intervention in these things, as you've pointed out, and I fully agree with you. The one thing I would always have said, either positive conflict or conflict addressed, often provides and produces the true thoughts. And those true thoughts are different to what has been perceived, different to what the fears have been, different to what the individuals have understood that's going on. Ultimately leads to more understanding and the truth being spoken by everyone. And we all know John's gospel says, if you know the truth, and the truth will set you free. I'm sure there's many here who in years gone past, in the early days of marriage, have had a bit of a tiff with the wife or the husband. And then when you get down to the conversation, what I thought you, and it's the I thought theory.
Yeah.
And if we get that early intervention, if I could take just a minute, Philip Zimbardo, 1969, he was a social psychologist from Stanford University. He did two trials. He took a vehicle. First one he planted in the Bronx, drove it there, parked it, opened the doors of the car, walked off. When he observed the car, within 3 days, the car was completely wrecked, completely trashed. He did exactly the same thing a couple of weeks later, only this time he set it, a very similar car, same condition, set it in an area of California called Palo Alto. It's a very affluent area, rich area. And of course, the opposite happened. But what he did was he then took a hammer, went out at night time, he took a hammer and he smashed the window and he let it sit. And because he smashed that window, then through time, bit by bit, young people came along and they trashed the vehicle, even in an affluent area rather. And that became picked up in 1982 by George Kelling, who was a social scientist, and James Wilson, who invented then the theory of the broken window. And it was this, that if a derelict building sits and a window gets broken, if you don't address that, then that will indicate to society that it doesn't matter. Then a second window will be broken, a third, and it'll be trashed. Whereas if we intervene early on and set the message clear and sound, this is not acceptable, this is not the way we are going to get on, then we can avoid all that conflict. We can avoid all of that potential confrontation that exists. And it's a matter of just by a team, as you rightly said earlier on, by a team sitting down and understanding each other and setting those boundaries and saying, let's set the rules of engagement. And this is how it will operate. And if I'm wrong, I expect you to tell me I'm wrong. And if you're wrong, I will tell you you're wrong. But we'll do it in the right way.
I absolutely agree, Ken. I think you talked about emotional intelligence and for leaders, particularly those leading a team. So this would, many of you may not be leading a church. I recognise there's a few pastors on the call because I would know the pastors in Ireland. But many of you, this will apply to your setting in your job, in your whatever. I think these principles are transferable. I think where a team feels they have the freedom and not just the freedom, but the invitation to express any point of view, that often is the earliest opportunity for things. And the thing with conflict is you don't recognize its absence when you're doing things well. But when you're doing things wrong, you certainly know its presence. And that's what's so hard about it, because it suddenly comes up and you think, oh, I wish I'd done this. And you're chasing your tail then in a situation. That's why the principles of what you establish as the culture in a team environment are so critical, because they will pay dividends in time. And there will still be occasions you get it wrong. As Ken says, in our emotional intelligence, sometimes we don't see that we're overstressed. And, we walk into a meeting, we're overstressed, we're under pressure, and just the tone of our voice can actually invite a different kind of response. But even that's retrievable if we're honest about it. And you talked, Ken, earlier about young leaders. Let me tell you what one of the greatest problems is with mature leaders, and I'll put myself in that category in my 50s, is a lack of emotional intelligence. Many of the mature leaders I work with don't want to recognize they've made a mistake, because what they do is they use their experience to present a case as to why they're right. And I think that however long we've been in leadership, there are some things we never graduate from. We graduate from school, we graduate from educational studies, but we never graduate from discipleship, ever. Never, ever, ever. We're constantly learning. And for mature leaders, and for those of you on this call who are members of local church sessions, and you're in your, the second half of life, let's say, that journey, please don't allow your experience to be what you weaponize to say to people, I can't be wrong because I've been there before. I think we all need to walk humbly before God. What does the Lord require of thee? To act justly, love mercy, walk humbly before your God. It's biblical discipleship. And at the heart of emotional intelligence is knowing that we are flawed and frail beings that need the Spirit of God. And so I think that having that awareness of oneself as a leader helps build that culture and environment that says to a leadership team, there's going to be nights this doesn't go well. And you're going to be, some of you will be tired, you'll not agree. But please, we're all allowed a mistake, but let's know how we're going to put things right. And that's the essence of what I think a positive approach to conflict is.
Yeah, Stuart, fantastic. Can I, on the back, just be a little bit controversial? Not controversial. I agree with dealing with it early. But a flip side of that, and just be interested to gain your view on it, is one of the things that has served me well in ministry is this thing that I call benign neglect. And that, and I think you maybe referenced an example earlier about, I can't remember, was it Dennis Phillips going and praying about a situation and God taking care of it? And certainly I've had an experience of that in my church in Aberdeen, where I remember having a conversation with the Lord saying, Lord, this is your church, it's not my church, you better sort this out. I was having this discussion with God, and God dealt with the situation without me having to really do much about it. But that aspect of, and I suppose for me, it's knowing when is to discern the right moment to actually intervene. And sometimes it may not be early. Sometimes it might be, you might do more damage. You might, if you allow the Spirit to work on a situation and the Spirit to speak to someone. I remember, again, just to use Paul as an example, we had a man who was homosexual in Edinburgh who came and got saved. And I'm from Northern Ireland, had very strong views about that. And I was saying, to Paul, you need to go and have a chat with him. You need to go and we need to sort this man out. He's become a Christian now. He needs to understand who he is in Christ, and we need to confront him with his sin now. And Paul was saying, no, let's just leave it. And there was this idea of benign neglect. And what happened was that the Spirit of God got on him, and the Spirit went to work on him without him or I sort of beating him over the head with a baseball bat and saying you need to conform or else. And I think that if we had have intervened, I think what God taught me in that example was that if we had have intervened with that legalistic, you have to change, we would have lost him. But that benign neglect allowed the Spirit to go to work on him. And so I think I agree that we need to intervene sooner before it gets to conflagration and war, of course, and all of that. But can you comment a little bit on your opinion about that idea of benign neglect and discernment?
Yeah, I do. I think sometimes intervention isn't always correction. Sometimes intervention is just love and concern. And so, of course, you don't want to intervene and jump all over somebody the slightest moment they express a sense of disagreement. I think it's about trying to discern and understand a situation. And I do agree, you don't want to run towards every individual thing. You wouldn't be able to cope. Most people were able to cope with all of that. So yes, there are times you just watch and see what the Spirit is doing, and it's not an art. It's like anything else in the spiritual life. It's not an art. It's just a sense of perception. Lord, I may get this wrong. I may get it wrong. I may leave it too long. But ultimately, I don't think we're necessarily talking. I think if we go back to Mayer's wheel, when we see a human need that we don't allow room for, don't respond to, sometimes that can grow. And I think that there are lots of situations where I agree with you, Mark. It's just time. It's just watch what's happening. But it's almost at least you're aware of it. I think that's what Ken's talking about, awareness of the problem, so you can know and be proactive when it's right. I think it's different. Benign neglect is not actually completely ignoring something. Yeah. It's a case of I'm choosing just to give it a bit of space.
Yeah.
And you can't fight over everything. I mean, a church that fights over everything, I'd leave myself. You just can't do that. There's some things we just have to leave. But there are also moments for the leader where you just have this sense, this indescribable sense the Spirit gives. I just need to ask a question here. And I think that early intervention for me is really low level, just trying to find out, is there a problem?
Yeah.
Is there a problem? I think there might be. Is there a problem? How can I help you? I'm going to pastor the person in that situation often. Now, of course, that works great if somebody is open and willing. And we've got those extremes that Roy was talking about earlier. You've just got somebody who enjoys being objectionable. There's usually one in every church. None of them are here in the meeting tonight, actually, but there's usually one in every church. I've learned there's the same kind of characters in every church. There's the pseudo-theologian and there's the objectionable person. And there's usually the same kind of characters in most churches. But actually, I think most people recognize that kind of spirit. And there's sometimes you can't deal with a man's spirit. Only God can deal with a man's spirit. You can speak into an attitude and to behaviors lovingly, but I think that there are moments you just have to say, Lord, I can't do any more with this. And there were sometimes I actually said to people, I'm not having a fight with you. Sorry, I'm not having a fight with you, because I was trying to protect myself in it as well.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Stuart. Terry, I see that hand.
Yeah, thank you, Stuart. That's some great stuff this evening. I think to go back to, the point that Ken was probably building up, really, I think one of my biggest frustrations in leadership and dealing with conflict is actually working within a culture where conflict avoidance is the norm. Yes. And I think to go back to the point, I think you really need to give the teams of people that you work with, particularly perhaps in a cross-cultural context, really, permission to argue sometimes, permission to say it's okay. I came at the situation we work in from, I was a high school teacher. I used to have heads of department meetings and they got quite heated. I always really enjoy it. And it was a really good, because everybody was up for the debate kind of thing. And then working in a cultural situation where that wasn't the norm was A, very frustrating, and B, it meant that a lot of the things you were trying to communicate and resolve actually kind of either went off tangentially or just went wrong, because there wasn't that basic agreement that it's okay to disagree, it's okay to argue, and it is important to set the boundaries of this is how we argue. But sometimes actually you have to go the step before that and say, actually it's quite normal and it's a good thing to do.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think the greatest teams laugh hilariously together, but also discuss robustly together. And there's some serious moments in great teams. In any team, there's a mixture of personalities, and there are those people who will say very little, but feel it very deeply. So I absolutely agree with you. I think that it's that step before that says, not only is this permissible, we're actually just being normal, we're being real, we're opening it out and having that environment. But I think that the primary leader in that situation, whether it's in a work environment or a church environment, has to almost be the most secure person in the room, really, to be able to handle that and encourage that, but also be able to moderate that. And if there's any sense that it's getting a little out of hand, it's getting personal, to somehow even gently say, hey, folks, and it takes leadership. And I think it's something that can only be learned as you practice it together. You should do that. It's not, you can teach, I can teach it tonight, but if you go away in your team settings and say, we want to encourage healthy disagreement, you know, it's something that you might have some difficult meetings, but it's something you'll learn how to do that. And it's not even healthy disagreement. It starts with just honest conversation. Let's be honest together. And if you don't feel comfortable with what's said or being done, please feel free to say it, but say it in the right way. You know, in that book, I recommend the book by Lance, in that chapter on getting comfortable with uncomfortable conversation, she says there's 3 rules: be clear, be candid, and be kind. And that's a real good conversation. You can be clear about what you're saying, you can be candid, you can be honest, but you still can do it in a kind way. And that makes for a real good, honest discussion.
Yeah, fantastic. Great points.
Stuart Wilson has his hand raised for a question.
Well spotted, Mel.
Wilson.
Yeah, thank you so much for this lesson. It is an incredible lesson, especially to study about confrontation in the church. Over there in Europe, I'll talk of cultural difference. You are more linear in dealing with confrontation and even dealing with the issues. But where I am from, you realize that we are more circular. You have to take a corner before you get where you are going. And one of the greatest setback that we go through in dealing with confrontation is love and caring, where somehow I feel if I confront this brother, if I confront this leader, he may think that I'm offensive and you not take it kindly. So what we are learning today is that no matter how, the best way to deal with it is to name it and deal with this as it is. And I'm realizing that true love is to confront and don't fear of offending, as long as it's a light timing or I'm inspired to do it. Thank you so much for tonight's lesson.
You're welcome, Wilson. Thank you for that contribution. And just very quickly say, I think that for me, positive conflict aims to be redemptive.
Yeah.
Not punitive, but redemptive.
Yeah, yeah, absolute great point. Thanks for that, Wilson. Any other questions that anyone has or comments?
I had a quick one, if that's all right. Yeah.
Well, Stuart, just to check in with you about breakout rooms. With the possibility of those in terms of time, and we just in terms of use of our time, to depend. Are you all right to run with this? Because I'm conscious that people.
I'm enjoying the interaction, so I think I'm enjoying this. So
all right.
I'm here as long as you guys want to do this, and probably leave breakout rooms.
Right. Okay. Bless you, man. Go ahead, Mark. What's your question?
Yeah. No, it's just again, thank you very much. Really enjoyed this. I have an engineering background, and I'll never forget. I went for an interview once with Volkswagen, and their mentality was to always go into meetings arguing. They says they wanted passionate employees to get the best outcome. So I just wonder, like, on one hand, Jesus says, a house divided can't stand, but then Proverbs, iron sharpens iron. So, in your opinion, when we are dealing with confrontation, should we be focusing the best use of our time? Should it be focused on conflicts which the outcome will advance the kingdom of God versus, decoration or preference or, the entitlement? So should we be focusing conflict on healthy constructive things, always pointing back to the vision of the church? Or?
Yeah, I think that sometimes there's got to be that common denominator in it, Mark. But I think I'm not so sure I'm comfortable with the notion that to disagree with each other is destructive in that way. You know, I think that diversity is just part of the complex order of creation. And you know, Ephesians 4 encourages us to make every effort to keep the unity of spirit in the bond of peace, but it also encourages us to understand that we are different and we have different perspectives. And I think it's possible to speak candidly about different perspectives, but respectfully. And I won't name the team, but I was in a team environment at a particular point in time. And the thing I found most difficult was that we were discouraged from being candid, and we weren't. The leader wouldn't say, "I don't want to be honest." You knew that you couldn't be honest by the reaction of the leader when you were honest. And unfortunately, my personality type, you know, I couldn't help but call out some of the things I thought were ridiculous, and it brought me into conflict with that person in those meetings quite regularly, because I just thought, well, what am I doing here if I can't actually just be honest and share a point of view? And I was getting all the more frustrated because there seemed like a load of nodding dogs in the room. I'm thinking, have you lost your marbles, you lot? Can't you see? You remember the children's nursery rhyme or fairy tale of the king decides to ride through the town naked, and some little boy, everybody's cheering and clapping, some little boy says, "The king's naked." And I found myself sometimes thinking, am I the only one that realises what this situation is? And often I'm not. I'm just the one that's probably got the jolly personality that will speak up. And I didn't enjoy being in that team environment, Mark, to be honest with you. But I find, like currently now in the national leadership team setting, I feel it's a really healthy environment where we're encouraged, you know, to be frank about what we're feeling. So I actually think we need to take the mindset that it's positive, to be honest. But I'd come back to your question. Anything that we're arguing over that is not for kingdom benefit isn't worth arguing over.
Yeah.
If we can't measure it by the heart of Christ for his church, if we're arguing to preserve our own preference and entitlement, as opposed to what's going to build the kingdom and transform men and women's lives by the grace of God, then actually, is it worth arguing about? And I agree with you. Maybe as a leader, sometimes I say, hang a second, fellas, women involved, please, didn't mean to be misogynist in that way. Hang a second, folks, what's this about? And that's what's different maybe from a corporate setting where you would be forced into thinking about what the company's objectives are. We're saying, what are the objectives of the kingdom here? And maybe that's where somebody has to speak up and say, I don't think this is of kingdom value, or that kind of language. So I would agree with you. There's got to be a foundation of what it is. You know, if we're arguing about the best way or discussing robustly the best way to win as many souls for Christ, that's a conversation worth having. But if it's about whether one particular song that was sung on Sunday has real theological depth and meaning, I think that's about preference. That's about interpretation, and I'm not really interested in those kind of arguments. I'm too long in the tooth now. I want to really get about the business we should be about.
Thank you. Thanks.
Fantastic, Stuart. Okay, now I'm gonna have to land this soon because, as you know, I don't eat my tea until after Academy. So, and there is some really, really nice lasagna waiting for me. So I'm motivated here. Now, I love you as the bits, guys, but I love lasagna. And then Stuart needs to go home, and I'm conscious that in Africa it's now 12:30. So Stuart, Terry, if there's any other burning one, we'll just fire that shot across your bows. But Terry, if you, and then we'll maybe give one other if there is, and if there's not, we'll maybe let Stuart go to the rest of his evening. Terry, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Mark. No, I think really one of the preconditions for successful conflict is successfully building the values that your organisation is built on. Judy and I are working, we're missionaries over in Kenya, so our work isn't as directly church leadership as I know many of yours is. But I think one of the books that really influenced me an enormous amount is by a guy called Simon Sinek, who isn't a Christian. It's a book called Start With Why. And it's really basically about understand completely why you're doing what you're doing. And then that makes for strong teams, it makes for strong decision making. And in terms of, the argument at Volkswagen, if you were passionately arguing about the same value, as you said, Stuart, I think that's incredibly valuable. But if you haven't got the same agenda to start with, Jesus's opening comments were follow me. And I think leadership, I think John Maxwell said leadership is about followership. So it's about creating a set of values that you all subscribe to first of all, and then the conflict arising from, well, how do we actually make those values take on life and do something with them?
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, agree very much.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Terry. Know your why. I was trying to think. There was a great clip on YouTube about, I can't remember who it was, but someone shared it with me about a guy asking this singer in it was in a church environment to sing, and he was a music teacher, and he sang Amazing Grace.
Oh yeah, it's that comedian guy.
Yes, that's right. It's just an amazing clip if you can find. Can you remember the name, Stuart?
I can't, but he then says to him, he sings this lovely gospel kind of guy, and he sings, but then he says to him, why are you singing that? Yeah. And he sang it, and it was amazing, wasn't it? Yeah.
Oh, it was incredible. So he knew his why, and he went from singing this pitch perfect Amazing Grace, every note in the right place, to singing it with feeling and emotion, and everyone was on their feet cheering, and there was this huge difference, and it was simply because he knew why he was singing it. So it's just to reinforce your point, Terry, but great stuff. All right. Last opportunity. Is there any other burning issue? The fact that there's still 29 folk on here says that we're still interested, but that's all right. Is there any other burning question? I'm coming into land. I feel like an auctioneer at the minute.
You're going to go and turn the microwave on now and put that.
Absolutely. We're going once. Going twice. I'm going to ask someone to close in prayer.
Mark, don't put the salad in the microwave.
No, we'll try not to. We'll ask Terry, since he kept me from my dinner, sir. You can close in prayer in a moment. Bless you, sir. Well, let me pray for you first of all, for your mom. I know that you guys are going through that, and I'd love to just stand with you in prayer at the moment and bless you. I know that you're it's a tough time for you guys, and just for all of us in the Academy, just remember Terry and Judy as they go through that particular difficult time with his mother. But Terry, let me pray for you, and then maybe if you could just close in prayer for us, sir, if that would be okay. Would that be all right?
That's great. Thank you.
Oh, yes. Let me do that. Father God, I just want to thank you for tonight, but Lord, we are mindful, Lord, that we're all here and we've all got our valleys and difficulties that we have to navigate and go through. And Lord, we lift Terry and Judy to you right now, and their family, and his mother particularly. Lord, we know that she's nearing the end of her race now, and Lord, that the finishing line is in sight. And Lord, there is this exhaustion and tiredness and stress that's involved in that moment right now. And Lord, I just want to pray for them as a family. I pray, Lord, that you would surround them. Lord, I pray, Lord, that you'd strengthen them. Lord, I pray, Lord, that you give them the comfort and the hope that only you can give. And so, Lord, thank you for them being here tonight. We love them. Lord, we know that, Lord, that you are using them for your glory in your kingdom. But Lord, I pray that you would draw close to them at this particular time in their lives, and just be with his mom. Lord, draw close to her, wrap your arms round about her. And Lord, as the sovereign God that you are, will you just bring her home to you when it's your time? And Lord, we pray for that, looking to you for all that you give and all that only you can give, both to Terry's mom and to the family. So Lord, bless them, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen.
Thank you
Terry,
so much.
Bless you, sir. If you can just close for us, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, Lord, I just thank you for this gathering this evening. I thank you for the wisdom and experience and the heart for the church and for leadership that Stuart shared with us today. Lord, I just pray that all that's been taught will sink deeply into our hearts. I pray, Lord, that we will be successful as we move forward in the roles that we have, wherever they are and whatever they are. Lord, I thank you that we can be joined on different continents. And I just pray, Lord, for the advancement of your kingdom through everybody here this evening. And I thank you, especially, Lord, for the time and the heart that Stuart's put into what he shared with us this evening. I pray that you bless him, Lord, in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Terry, thank you so much for that. Stuart, again, we just, on behalf of Academy, just want to thank you for your input tonight. It really was just incredibly practical. We have recorded this. It will be a resource for others, I'm sure, and there's so much in it that we can dip back into. So can I say thank you, sir, for all that you've done for us tonight. Really appreciate it. You've done such a good job. We're going to have to ask you back, obviously. So all right, guys. Well, that's us. We are back next week for our 10th and final lesson of this module. Malcolm Duncan will be sharing next week to close off this course on leadership and culture. Thanks so much for being here. Trust that you all have a great week, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time. God bless.
Bless you.
Bless you.
Thanks, Stuart.
Bye. God bless.
Bye.